Привет! So in this video I'm going to address three issues that Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership need to resolve in 2025 if they are to continue to prosecute the Russo-Ukrainian war and their invasion of Ukraine to the same intensity that they have been doing in the last few months. We've seen the highest daily losses in terms of Russian personnel, massive burn-through rates on their materiel or their equipment, and they seem to be starting to creak financially. The economic front at home is looking particularly dire as we go into what will be the third year of this war, and almost the 1,000th day since the beginning of the extended invasion by Russia of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. So these three issues are men, money, and materiel. So that would be the three. So let's start with men, voluntary manpower. So Russia did have one partial mobilization that occurred in the autumn of 2022. Since then, they have relied on increasing their manpower through voluntary means, basically by incentives, financial incentives, which obviously plays into the third issue, the money issue that Putin is going to be facing. But basically, they've been offering huge salaries, absolute astronomical signing on bonuses and salaries for new volunteers to the military, and especially because Russia, if you come from a rural area and you're doing something that's not particularly high skilled in daily life, maybe you're only making $200, $300, $400, $500 per month, and then suddenly you get sign on bonuses potentially. If depending on where you sign up in the country, maybe over $20,000. So you're talking about several years' wages being just as a sign-on bonus. Plus, you get obviously a lot of other payments when you're in the military, a few thousand a month. Again, there are also payments to your family if you are killed in action, and that can be proven. So these are big incentives, but the Russians are trying to recruit 30,000 soldiers per month, and they are burning through at the moment. In terms of missing in action, wounded in action, and killed in action, more than 30,000, actually quite a bit in excess of that 30,000 mark. So it's becoming harder and harder for them to recruit volunteers. They're offering huge amounts of money. They obviously quite famously went through in the Prigozhin era, which was in 2022 and 2023. They recruit a lot from the prisons in Russia. Their prison population has plummeted. They're actually closing a lot of prisons in Russia because so many prisoners have volunteered. And again, the number of new volunteers they're going to get from prisons or people who have legal problems, they've changed that you can avoid prosecution basically and resolve your legal problems by signing a contract to join the military. They're running out of those kind of prisoners. So either they're going to have to continue to increase salaries and sign on bonuses, which will become pretty outrageous in terms of the salary at a certain point. That obviously bites into their finances, or they will have to get soldiers from somewhere else. Now, somewhere else could be, we've seen from other countries, we've seen North Korea. There are accusations and intelligence that North Korea has sent about 13,000 soldiers to fight on the Russian side. North Korea obviously has a huge pool of manpower that they could send potentially, but 13,000, if you're looking for in excess of 30,000 new soldiers per month, well, 13,000 isn't really going to be a game changer in the war. Now, if North Korea was to start sending 10 to 20,000 new soldiers into the battle every month, then that obviously would be significant. But so far, they have not done that, and it remains to be seen whether they would do that. If Russia cannot incentivize Russians to sign up for the military and cannot get soldiers from other countries, pretty soon they are going to have to look at another mobilization, which will be deeply unpopular in Russia. And presumably that is why Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership have not gone for that so far. When they had that partial mobilization back in 2022, it's estimated over 1 million Russians actually left the country. So they mobilized in principle 300,000 men, and then 1 million left. So yeah, the consequences are quite severe in terms of going for that mobilization, but they may soon be faced with no choice. We just have to see. That is one issue that will need to be resolved. Now, the second issue is the materiel. Russia's already getting a huge number of its artillery shells from North Korea. I think it's estimated between 5 and 8 million were supplied last year. The quality of those shells is debated, but at the end of the day, it's a massive amount of ordnance that is being sent. Obviously, they also get the infamous Shahed drones from Iran and other ballistic missiles from both Iran and North Korea. And China is supplying dual-use technology for Russia to assist them in building their equipment for their war machine and their military-industrial complex. Now, Russia has had a strategy of not actually creating very many new things for this war, but actually relying on the enormous stocks of Soviet material that was left over from the Cold War. The Soviets basically built a huge amount of equipment that they could use to attack Europe. I mean, obviously, during the Cold War, what we could define as Western Europe or the NATO countries were further to the west, maybe about 2,000 kilometers than they are today. So they have built this huge amount of equipment to use in a land war, potentially with a nuclear component in basically what is Mitteleuropa, Germany, and that we'd be fighting there. Obviously, that stock is not of the highest quality compared to today. We've now moved on about 50 years since most of it was developed and built. However, it still can do damage, and refurbishing that and upgrading it has basically been the strategy. However, they are burning through a huge amount of that Soviet-era stockpile, and they are expected, if they continue with this intensity, to start having problems with finding old stuff that they can refurbish sometime in 2025, maybe 2026, depending on what we're talking about, tanks and artillery. So that is something they will have to address in 2025 if they continue to burn through so much equipment. I was watching a video from yesterday in the Kursk region, which is part of Russia de jure, which Ukraine is now occupying, and Russia burned through over 30 armored vehicles from that area, mainly, that have been upgraded. And yeah, they're just going through an enormous amount of that old Soviet equipment. So second thing they'll need to obviously resolve is materiel. They could, of course, get it from somewhere else. Maybe North Korea can increase what they're able to give them. Maybe China will change and start supplying the Russian army. Maybe they can get some way to increase their own military-industrial complex. But they will need a solution to that if they're going to continue to prosecute the war at this incredible intensity. Now, the third issue is probably the most important at the end of the day, and that is money. Financial situation in Russia is pretty dire. The economic situation is not looking good. They are spending about 40% of their state budget on internal security and the military. So if you take that all in combination, the internal security is to basically suppress the population in large part, and then obviously prosecuting the war with the military. It is the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. It is extremely expensive. Now, Russia didn't have much public debt before 2022. They were strategic about that, and they'd actually built up a significant war chest. It's estimated about 600 billion US dollars of a war chest to use in terms of prosecuting this war. However, they weren't so strategic about where they put that, and 300 billion approximately, so about half of the war chest, is actually frozen in Western financial institutions, so they cannot access those funds for now. And in fact, the interest accruing on those funds is now being used to finance Ukraine to a certain extent. It's not a huge amount of money, obviously, on the interest, but it is kind of ironic to see that. A lot of pro-Russian commentators, they like to cite the World Bank, IMF figures, which basically rely on Russian figures, so they're not the most reliable. But if you think about it, in general, war is extremely, extremely expensive. And as you divert more and more of your economy towards the war, away from what are more productive endeavors in the private sector, then obviously in the long term you weaken your economy quite considerably. And it is debatable whether Russia really would have the finances to continue with this intensity of an armed conflict into late 2025, 2026. Russia is very dependent on resource prices like oil and gas. And with the election of Donald Trump, one of his mantras was drill, baby, drill, which would suggest that he is intending to drill for more oil in the United States, maybe other resources that will be competitive with Russian resources. That will push down the prices of oil and possibly gas, basically Russia's main exports, and that will mean that their stake offers will be even lower. They obviously face issues with Western sanctions. They make everything more expensive. Of course, they can find workarounds for a lot of it, but it basically pushes up the price. They have to pay premiums to buy stuff and sell and export in general, and then maybe they're exporting to India and then they end up with all these rupees, then they got to spend it on something and that's difficult and they got to pay and pay. So basically the whole endeavor is extremely expensive. Wars are expensive in general. And what is Russia getting in return for that war? Well, they have occupied an extra 10, 12% of Ukraine, and they destroyed much of that in taking it, especially cities like, if we look at Mariupol, for example, and that actually will become a net loss because in theory they would need to start to rebuild that and invest money, supply pensions and social services to the people living there. There isn't much productive activity going on. Okay, Russia has and can continue to loot the places that they occupy, but that only has a very short-term value. Basically, the war is a huge net loss and a huge drain on the Russian economy. And ultimately, if you have no money, then you cannot continue to prosecute the war. Now, Russia needs to look for a solution to that. Maybe a solution with China could continue to finance them or some other country, but they would have to give someone like China something pretty juicy in return for doing that, because with Western sanctions and secondary sanctions, that would possibly have consequences for a country that was enabling Russia in that way. So one thing that they might do is, which they've started to do, is to give basic control of some of their territory in the Far East or access to some resources to countries like China or maybe India in the long term in order for them to provide financing for Russia to continue its war in the short term. We'll just have to see. But they are creaking economically, and a lot of the criticism about Western sanctions, they're ineffective, is not really looking at the long-term strategic impact of sanctions in general, which pushes up the price of doing business, further weakens the Russian economy. And if resource prices are low, they're spending 40% of their budget, I think it's about 7 or 8% of GDP on this war, plus internal security, then that is a massive, massive long-term issue, and it will undermine the war. Whether it will prove to be catastrophic in the short to medium term, we just have to see. But definitely long term, you cannot continue to do that over the long term and continue to thrive and ultimately emerge victorious. So those are the 3 issues in today's video. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Does Russia have these 3 issues, and whether you agree with me, obviously, and also what you think their potential solutions are, because this is a war of attrition at the moment, at least, and whoever lasts the longest will presumably emerge victorious in spite of Trump's proposals for peace. You can look at my video from yesterday if you want to know more what I think about that. So I will say, do pobачення, slava Ukraini, Rom slava, and see you in tomorrow's video. Maybe I'll shoot it outside if the weather is a little bit better.